control over stuff to people in a pretty random, unpredictable way would make it very difficult for anybody to plan, to engage in relationships that presuppose the availability of property and so forth. So reliability matters. Coordination, a system of property rights and rules is a good system, I think, to the extent that it allows people to coordinate their activities over time. As I've already noted in connection with some of the matters that the Tannehills put on the table, I think we learn from people like Hayek and Mises that a price system in a market serves to coordinate people's decisions about the production and distribution of goods and services, and not just the price system, but all of the distributed information that's out there can be coordinated, can be integrated in a way that allows people to coordinate their actions through a market. But the operation of a market requires a certain stable set of property rights. It doesn't require just one set, but again, there's got to be some limit on the options there so that people, in fact, can use the property system to coordinate their decisions about producing goods and services. Peacemaking is clearly an important function as well of a property system, and again limits the kinds of property rules there can be. If you have property rights and property rules, then people are much less likely to step on each other's toes. Think about the old adage that good fences make good neighbors. Incentivization matters. People are more likely to be productive in ways that benefit everyone if indeed there's a property rule in place, or set of property rules, allowing them to benefit from the work that they've done and to reap some profits from their work. Productivity, more specifically, we can talk about the productive use of a particular piece of property. And that certainly matters in determining whether or not a property rule is a good rule. Does that property rule tend to encourage folks to leave land fallow, to leave property undeveloped, not out of a desire for conservation, but just out of laziness? I mean, conservation is another matter. I mean, conservation is precisely one way of developing a parcel, and I'm not arguing against conservation at all. But I'm saying if somebody simply ignores land, I think that's a problem, and that of course, is why, or at least one key reason why we have rules allowing for adverse possession and so forth. We don't really like to see property lie fallow. Generosity. If we don't have some kinds of ownership rights, then people aren't going to be able to give gifts to each other, and that clearly, I think, is a problem. Compensation. Clearly, if there's no capacity for people to be compensated for their work, if there's no link between their doing work that others value and they're receiving something for that, that's going to be a problem. And again, it's difficult to provide that kind of compensation without a property system, and indeed the property rules clearly ought to honor people's labor. Whether we have an exclusively labor-based theory of property is another matter, but at least compensation for labor certainly needs to be a piece of a just property system. Simplicity clearly is another factor that's relevant in shaping the contours of a just property system. If rules are easy to understand, to articulate, and to apply, then that, I think, counts in favor of those rules. And Richard Epstein, with whom I have a variety of disagreements on other matters, certainly has made a plausible case that property rules that are simple, the first possessor of a previously unowned parcel gets the parcel and has exclusive control over it and is free to alienate it and transfer it. That's a very simple rule, and that's a simple rule that beats some other more complex rules, at least most of the time. Stewardship. If somebody is not responsible for a given piece of property, then it's likely that nobody will take care of it. Okay? Somebody needs to have particular responsibility for a particular item. So that's something that matters as well and provides another reason for a property system and another limit on the kinds of rules that a property system could reasonably contain. And then there's finally the issue of identity. This is an issue because there are at least some pieces of property that really become parts of who we are. Think about a family farm that's been in the same family for 6 generations. And I think that identity interest certainly ought to matter in determining how we think about property rights and rules. So there are at least these 11 different underlying rationales for a property system, which tend to overlap. They tend most of the time, not always, but most of the time, to tilt in the same direction and to provide, I think, a fairly robust basis for a set of individual property rights. Now, the Tannehills operate in a somewhat different frame. They've got a kind of neo-Lockean view here. I recognize the view I've just laid out is more complicated. I also think it's probably finally more reasonable and seems a bit less kind of suspended in midair than perhaps the view of the Tannehills. In any event, the Tannehills clearly are right that a system of stable property rights is important in a whole range of ways and can certainly help to maintain the order of a stateless society. Butler Schaefer, much more recently, wrote a book about property called Boundaries of Order, and I think he's exactly right that the existence of boundaries of the kind that property rules provide is crucial to maintaining orderly interactions within a society. Also, I think the Tannehills are surely right that taxation represents something like the enslavement of people. Their argument, of course, is I put time into making money, and if that money gets taken, it's in effect as if my time has been taken. Now, I do think it's an interesting question, however, whether this entails the conclusion that just any denial of absolute control over one's property amounts to enslavement. That's the view that the Tannehills take. It's a very tidy view, and I think it's not a silly view, but I do think it's worth asking about. For instance, I think people often assume that ideas about limitations on people's use of their property are recent statist innovations. But I think we can go back centuries and find the recognition that this really isn't the case. So we find Thomas Aquinas, for instance, hardly a kind of rabid, loony, Stalinist, saying, look, in emergency situations, at any rate, if you need something badly enough that somebody else has, you're entitled to take it. And there's no reason to think of this as robbery, even if you act by stealth. Several centuries later, we find John Locke, whose view of property rights really provides the basis for lots of thinking about this on the part of pro-market thinkers. Locke says charity entitles somebody to as much of another person's resources as will be needed to succor him in a state of great want. Locke doesn't say this while denying his basic point that people can homestead property and acquire title to it. So whether you finally think that Aquinas or Locke are right, I just think it's worth noting that people who are not representatives of some modern statist consensus nonetheless might not be sure that enslavement necessarily followed whenever anybody used anything of yours. Roderick Long's done some lovely work on the value of easements in a stateless society. And easement, of course, says the right to hold property and, largely to control it certainly stays with the owner, but nonetheless other people might have the right to pass over it, for instance. So, things to think about. Now, without dwelling on this point too much more, I do just want to note that marking a boundary doesn't seem adequate to establish ownership. And the Tannehills recognize that somebody might think this is a problem, but they really think that marking boundaries is all that's required. Now, it seems to me that previously unowned land has to be actively claimed in ways that go beyond just delimiting that land. Otherwise, it seems to me as if all one has claimed is the boundary land itself and not the land surrounded by the boundary, and indeed that people could reasonably claim a kind of prescriptive easement that would allow them to cross over that boundary and get to the land inside, since that land really effectively hadn't been claimed. Now, the Tannehills say,